The laughter started the moment Shirley Thompson walked into the officers' lounge at Fort Braxton. It wasn't cruel laughter, not exactly, but the kind of uncomfortable chuckling that happens when people don't know how to react to something unexpected. Here was a woman in her late 20s, moving slowly on aluminum crutches, wearing civilian clothes that hung loose on her thin frame, carrying what looked like a small jewelry box tucked under her arm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Bradley Morrison was the first to speak up, his voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that military officers use when they want to sound sympathetic while maintaining their authority. "Ma'am, I think you might be lost. The visitor center is in Building C, across the courtyard." Shirley paused near the coffee station, shifting her weight carefully between her crutches. The small chain around her neck caught the fluorescent light for just a moment, revealing what looked like a simple pendant hanging beneath her sweater. "Actually, I'm here for the quarterly briefing, Specialist Thompson reporting for duty." The silence that followed was deafening. Major Helen Vasquez, who had been reviewing personnel files at a corner table, looked up with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. We don't have any specialists on crutches assigned to this unit." "Temporary assignment," Shirley replied quietly, pulling a folded set of orders from her jacket pocket. "Combat Support Specialist, transferred from Walter Reed for light-duty evaluation." The silence that followed was deafening. Major Helen Vasquez, who had been reviewing personnel files at a corner table, looked up with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. We don't have any specialists on crutches assigned to this unit." "Temporary assignment," Shirley replied quietly, pulling a folded set of orders from her jacket pocket. "Combat Support Specialist, transferred from Walter Reed for light-duty evaluation." Captain Morrison took the papers with barely concealed skepticism, scanning them quickly before passing them to Major Vasquez. The authenticity was undeniable: official letterhead, proper signatures, all the bureaucratic elements that couldn't be faked. But the woman standing before them didn't fit any of their preconceptions about combat veterans. "Light duty," Major Vasquez repeated, as if testing the words. "And what exactly did you do before your injury, Specialist Thompson?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Shirley's grip tightened slightly on her crutches, and for just a moment something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger, but something deeper and more complex. "Logistics coordination in Afghanistan, supply chain management, mostly." The dismissive glances exchanged between the officers were subtle but unmistakable. Supply chain management, paperwork and inventory tracking, the kind of rear echelon support work that kept the military functioning but rarely earned recognition or respect from frontline officers. "Well," Captain Morrison said, his tone already shifting toward the patronizing register he might use with a wayward teenager, "I'm sure we can find something appropriate for your current situation. Filing, maybe some data entry, nothing too strenuous." Shirley simply nodded, accepting the condescension with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the conversation. She understood that these officers saw her crutches first, her apparent weakness second, and her actual military service as a distant third consideration. They had already decided who she was and what she was worth. What they couldn't see was the weight of the small pendant hanging beneath her sweater, or the reason she never spoke about the 3 weeks in February 2021 when her supply convoy had taken a wrong turn outside Kabul and encountered something that would change not just her own life, but the lives of countless others in ways she was still discovering. The injury that put her on crutches hadn't happened in some heroic firefight or dramatic explosion. It had been almost mundane in its ordinariness, a piece of shrapnel from a roadside bomb that had torn through her left leg while she was checking inventory manifests in the back of a supply truck. The kind of wound that left permanent damage but didn't make for inspiring stories or medal ceremonies. At least, that's what everyone assumed. Dr. Patricia Chen at Walter Reed had been the first person to suggest that Shirley might be suffering from something more complex than simple physical trauma. During their sessions, Shirley had displayed symptoms that didn't quite fit the standard profile for combat-related PTSD. She was withdrawn, certainly, but not in the way that suggested fear or anxiety. Instead, she seemed to be carrying the weight of something unfinished, some piece of knowledge or responsibility that she couldn't quite articulate. "Tell me about the convoy," Dr. Chen had said during one of their early sessions, her voice gentle but insistent. "Standard supply run," Shirley replied automatically. "Routine logistics operation. Medical supplies, food, equipment, nothing unusual." But Dr. Chen had been working with combat veterans long enough to recognize the difference between forgetting and choosing not to remember. There were gaps in Shirley's narrative, places where her timeline became vague or contradictory, moments when she would stop talking entirely and stare out the window as if seeing something that wasn't there. The truth was that Shirley remembered everything about that convoy with painful clarity. She remembered the manifest showing medical supplies bound for a forward operating base that intelligence reports had suggested might be under imminent threat. She remembered the radio chatter that had grown increasingly urgent as their small convoy of 3 vehicles made its way through territory that was supposed to be secure. Most of all, she remembered the decision she had made when their convoy commander, Sergeant First Class David Kim, had received new orders directing them to return to base rather than complete their delivery. Orders that would have left a small medical outpost without the antibiotics and surgical supplies they desperately needed to treat wounded soldiers who were expected to arrive within hours. The choice Shirley had made in that moment, to override her superior's decision and insist that the convoy continue to its original destination, had been based on nothing more than a sick feeling in her stomach and the knowledge that people were going to die if those medical supplies didn't reach their intended recipients. She had been right, but being right had come with consequences she was still trying to understand. The medical outpost they had reached, despite orders to turn back, had received over 30 wounded soldiers that night from a firefight that intelligence hadn't predicted and commanders hadn't prepared for. The antibiotics Shirley had insisted on delivering had prevented sepsis in at least a dozen cases. The surgical supplies had made the difference between life and death for soldiers whose injuries would have been fatal without immediate intervention. But the convoy's extended route had taken them through territory where they encountered an IED that had been intended for a much larger military convoy. The explosion that had damaged Shirley's leg had also destroyed classified equipment and compromised radio communications that had been essential for coordinating the very medical evacuations that her supplies had made possible. In the weeks that followed, while Shirley recovered in various medical facilities, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge through intelligence reports and after-action reviews. The medical outpost that had received her supplies had become the center of a critical casualty collection point that had processed over 200 wounded soldiers during a major Taliban offensive that had caught coalition forces off guard. The antibiotics and surgical supplies that Shirley had delivered against orders had not only saved the initial 30 wounded soldiers, but had made it possible for the medical facility to function as a trauma center for the larger operation that followed. Military analysts estimated that her decision had directly or indirectly saved the lives of more than 50 American and Allied soldiers. But that information had been classified, buried in intelligence reports that Shirley wasn't cleared to see, analyzed by officers whose names she didn't know, and used to make strategic decisions about operations she would never hear about. All she knew was that she had disobeyed orders, sustained an injury that would affect her for the rest of her life, and received what seemed like a routine commendation medal that her commanding officers had presented with the same enthusiasm they might show for a required safety briefing. The medal itself was a simple bronze disc hanging from a ribbon that looked unremarkable compared to the colorful decorations worn by officers who had never been closer to combat than a Pentagon briefing room. Shirley had worn it exactly once during the brief ceremony where it had been presented, and then had put it away in the small jewelry box she now carried with her everywhere, not out of pride, but because she couldn't quite bring herself to throw it away. What she didn't know, as she stood in the officers' lounge at Fort Braxton listening to Captain Morrison and Major Vasquez discuss her fitness for filing duties, was that her name had been appearing in classified briefings for the past 8 months. Intelligence analysts had been tracking the ripple effects of her decision to complete that supply run, and that those effects had extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis she had helped resolve. The pendant hanging around her neck, hidden beneath her sweater where the officers couldn't see it, contained not just a simple commendation medal, but something that would soon change everything these people thought they knew about the quiet woman on crutches who had just been assigned to their unit for light duty evaluation. The assignment they gave Shirley was exactly what she had expected. A windowless office in the basement of Building 7, surrounded by filing cabinets that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, and a computer so old it took 15 minutes to boot up. Her official title was Administrative Support Specialist, which was military speak for, "We don't know what to do with you, so you can organize our paperwork." The office itself told a story of bureaucratic neglect. Water stains on the ceiling tiles suggested plumbing problems that had been temporarily fixed multiple times but never actually resolved. The fluorescent light above her desk flickered with an irregular rhythm that made reading difficult after more than an hour. A small space heater in the corner fought a losing battle against the perpetual chill that seemed to seep through the concrete walls. Major Vasquez had walked her down to the basement with the efficiency of someone checking an unpleasant task off their to-do list. "You'll be working on digitizing old personnel files," she had explained, gesturing toward a stack of boxes that reached nearly to the ceiling. "Some of these records go back to the 80s. Everything needs to be scanned, cataloged, and entered into the new database system." The task was mind-numbing in its repetitiousness. Each file contained the same basic information: name, rank, service dates, assignments, commendations, disciplinary actions, medical records. Thousands of individual stories reduced to standardized forms and official documentation. Lives measured in acronyms and regulation numbers. For the first week, Shirley worked in complete isolation. The basement level of Building 7 was rarely visited by anyone except maintenance staff, and even they seemed to hurry through their tasks as if the underground location made them uncomfortable. The only sounds were the hum of the ancient air circulation system and the rhythmic clicking of the scanner as Shirley processed file after file. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But gradually, she began to notice patterns in the records that struck her as odd. Many of the files she was digitizing belonged to soldiers who had served in support roles: logistics specialists, communications technicians, supply coordinators, medics. On the surface, their service records appeared routine, unremarkable. Standard assignments, typical rotations, the kind of military careers that never made headlines or inspired movies. Yet buried within these ordinary-looking files were commendations and awards that seemed disproportionate to the described duties. A communications specialist who had received a Bronze Star for maintaining critical communications infrastructure during enemy contact. A supply sergeant who had been awarded a Meritorious Service Medal for exceptional performance in forward logistics operations. A medic who had earned a Purple Heart and an Army Commendation Medal for distinguished service under hostile conditions. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but Shirley had enough military experience to recognize when official descriptions were deliberately understated. These weren't routine support operations, these were combat situations where support personnel had been forced to make critical decisions under extreme circumstances. What bothered her most was how familiar some of these stories seemed. The communications specialist whose citation mentioned maintaining operations during a complex tactical situation involving multiple casualty events. The supply sergeant whose medal had been awarded for ensuring critical materials reached their intended destination despite significant operational challenges. The similarities to her own experience were unsettling. The same careful language that avoided specifics while suggesting something significant had occurred. The same emphasis on duty completion despite obstacles. The same sense that there was more to the story than what appeared in the official record. 3 weeks into her assignment, Shirley encountered a file that stopped her cold. The name on the folder was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, and the photograph clipped to the inside cover showed a young woman in her early 20s with serious dark eyes and the kind of composed expression that suggested someone who took their responsibilities seriously. Santos had been a logistics coordinator with the 82nd Airborne Division deployed to Iraq in 2004. Her service record showed routine supply operations, convoy security duties, and standard administrative responsibilities. But attached to her file was a Bronze Star citation that was longer and more detailed than most of the awards Shirley had been seeing. Staff Sergeant Santos distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous conduct during combat operations against a hostile force in Al-Anbar province on March 15, 2004. When her supply convoy came under intense enemy fire, Staff Sergeant Santos voluntarily exposed herself to hostile fire to coordinate the evacuation of wounded personnel and ensure the security of critical medical supplies intended for forward operating bases. Her quick thinking and disregard for personal safety resulted in the successful completion of the mission and prevented the loss of materials essential to ongoing combat operations. Staff Sergeant's extraordinary heroism and dedication to duty reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. Shirley read the citation 3 times, her hands trembling slightly as she held the document. The language was more specific than most of the awards she had been processing, but it still felt incomplete. What kind of enemy fire? How many were wounded? What made the medical supplies so critical? Why was a logistics coordinator responsible for evacuation coordination? She found herself staring at Maria Santos's photograph, wondering what had really happened on that day in 2004. Wondering if Santos had ever felt the same combination of certainty and doubt that Shirley had experienced during her own supply run. Wondering if Santos had also made a split-second decision that had seemed obvious at the time but had grown more complicated in memory. The next file in the stack belonged to Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, a medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2010 and 2014. His Purple Heart citation described an incident where he had been wounded while providing medical aid to coalition forces during sustained enemy contact. His Silver Star citation was even more intriguing. Sergeant First Class Hayes distinguished himself by gallantry in action while serving as senior medic with the 10th Mountain Division during combat operations in Helmand Province on June 8, 2013. When his unit came under attack by a superior enemy force, Sergeant Hayes repeatedly exposed himself to intense hostile fire to treat wounded soldiers. Despite being wounded himself, he continued to provide life-saving medical treatment and coordinated casualty evacuation procedures that resulted in the survival of 12 critically wounded personnel. His exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty saved multiple lives and exemplified the finest traditions of the medical corps. 12 lives saved in a single engagement. Shirley tried to imagine the chaos of that situation, the weight of responsibility Hayes must have felt, the split-second decisions between treating one soldier and moving to help another. She wondered if he had ever questioned whether he had made the right choices, whether he had done enough, whether someone else might have saved more lives. As she continued processing files, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Many of these decorated soldiers had served during the same general time periods and in the same geographic regions where Shirley had been deployed. Some had even operated out of bases or forward operating posts that she recognized from her own service. More troubling was the realization that several of these soldiers had been involved in operations that had directly or indirectly supported missions I had been part of. The communication specialist who had maintained contact during a complex tactical situation had been operating equipment that had coordinated supply deliveries to bases where Shirley had delivered materials. The supply sergeant, who had ensured critical materials reached their destination, had been part of a logistics network that had included Shirley's own convoy operations. For the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, Shirley began to wonder if her basement assignment was as random as it had appeared. The files she was processing weren't simply old records that needed digitizing. They were the service records of soldiers whose stories intersected with broader operational patterns, whose individual actions had contributed to larger strategic outcomes that none of them had been fully briefed on at the time. The realization that her own service might be connected to these other stories in ways she didn't understand was both fascinating and terrifying. It suggested that the simple supply run that had earned her a bronze commendation medal might have been part of something much larger and more significant than she had ever imagined. But it also raised questions that she wasn't sure she wanted answered. If her convoy had been part of a larger operational pattern, why hadn't she been briefed on the strategic context? If her decision to complete the supply delivery had been as critical as these other soldiers' actions seemed to have been, why had her award been so routine? And most importantly, if these files were being digitized now, who was planning to review them and why? Late on a Friday afternoon, as Shirley was preparing to leave for the weekend, she discovered something that changed everything she thought she understood about her assignment. While organizing the completed files, she noticed that each folder had a small notation in the upper right corner that she had initially assumed was a filing system reference number. Looking more closely, she realized that the notations weren't random numbers. They were dates, and they all fell within a specific range: January 2021 to March 2021, the same 3-month period when Shirley had been deployed on the convoy operations that had led to her injury and subsequent medal. Every single file she had been assigned to digitize belonged to a soldier whose service had overlapped with that specific time frame. Every medal, every commendation, every award she had been processing had been earned during operations that had taken place during the exact same period when she had been making supply runs through territory that intelligence reports had suggested might be under threat. The basement office that had seemed like bureaucratic exile suddenly felt like something else entirely. She wasn't processing random historical records. She was documenting a specific military operation that had involved dozens of support personnel whose individual actions had contributed to a larger mission that none of them had been fully informed about at the time. And if the pattern held true, if her own service record was eventually added to this collection, it would mean that the simple bronze medal hanging around her neck represented something far more significant than a routine commendation for completing a supply delivery. As Shirley gathered her things and prepared to leave Building 7, she made a decision that would change the trajectory of her time at Fort Braxton. Instead of simply processing the files as assigned, she was going to start keeping track of the patterns she was seeing. She was going to map the connections between these different soldier stories and try to understand what they had all been part of without knowing it. She was going to figure out what had really happened during those 3 months in early 2021 and why someone wanted these particular service records digitized now, nearly 2 years after the operations they documented had taken place. The small pendant hanging beneath her sweater seemed heavier as she climbed the stairs out of the basement, as if the weight of all the stories she had been reading had somehow transferred to the simple bronze medal she carried everywhere but never displayed. For the first time since receiving it, she began to wonder if that medal might represent something worth displaying after all. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later in the most unexpected way possible. Shirley had developed a system for tracking the patterns she was discovering in the files using a small notebook to record names, dates, locations, and award citations. She kept the notebook hidden beneath a stack of outdated training manuals, pulling it out only when she was certain no one would interrupt her work. Her investigation had revealed something remarkable. The 27 files she had processed so far represented soldiers from 8 different units deployed across 4 different provinces in Afghanistan, all during the same 3-month window. But they weren't random assignments scattered across the theater of operations. When she plotted their locations on a hand-drawn map, a clear pattern emerged. Every single one of these soldiers had been involved in operations that supported a specific corridor of forward operating bases, stretching from Kabul to the Pakistani border. The communication specialists had maintained contact between these bases. The supply sergeants had moved materials along the same routes. The medics had staffed casualty collection points that served the same geographic area. They had all been part of a coordinated logistics network that had operated during a critical period when intelligence reports had suggested increased Taliban activity in the region. And Shirley's own convoy operations had been an essential component of that same network. The realization should have been satisfying, confirmation that her service had been more significant than she had understood. Instead, it raised new questions that kept her awake at night. If this had been a coordinated operation involving dozens of support personnel, why hadn't she been briefed on the broader strategic context? Why had their individual contributions been recognized with routine awards rather than the kind of commendations typically associated with major military operations? Most troubling of all, why were these files being digitized now, nearly 2 years after the operations had taken place? The answer came from an unexpected source. Specialist Jennifer Walsh, a young clerk from the personnel office who had been assigned to help with the digitization project during busy periods. Jennifer was barely 22, fresh out of basic training, with the kind of enthusiasm for military regulations that suggested she hadn't yet learned to be cynical about bureaucratic procedures. "I've never seen anything like this," Jennifer said during her second week of helping with the files. She was processing a stack of commendation paperwork, cross-referencing awards with service records to ensure accuracy in the digital database. Usually, when we digitize historical records, it's because someone from the Pentagon or Army Personnel Command has requested specific information for promotion reviews or security clearance investigations. Shirley looked up from her scanner, trying to keep her voice casual. "What makes these different?" "The request didn't come from Personnel Command," Jennifer replied, holding up a work order that Shirley had never seen before. "It came from Army Intelligence. And look at this signature block." She handed the document to Shirley, pointing to a series of authorizations at the bottom of the page. The request had been signed by Colonel Richard Foster from the Army Intelligence Center, but it had been countersigned by someone from the Defense Intelligence Agency and approved by an office Shirley had never heard of, the Joint Special Operations Command Historical Review Board. "I asked my supervisor about it," Jennifer continued, "and she said she'd never seen a digitization request with this many authorization levels. Usually, it's just a routine personnel request. This looks like they're preparing these files for some kind of formal review process." The implications were staggering. If Army Intelligence was reviewing the service records of everyone who had been involved in the logistics network Shirley had identified, it suggested that the operations they had all participated in had been far more significant than any of them had realized at the time. But it also suggested something else, that someone with the authority to initiate formal intelligence reviews believed there was more to these stories than appeared in the official records. Someone thought these routine supply runs and support operations had been connected to something important enough to warrant investigation by multiple intelligence agencies. That evening, Shirley made a decision that she knew was risky but felt necessary. Instead of going straight home, she drove to the main library in downtown Fayetteville and used their public computers to search for information about military operations in Afghanistan during early 2021. What she found was a collection of news reports that painted a picture of a region in transition. During January and February of 2021, coalition forces had been implementing the final phases of the withdrawal agreement that had been negotiated with the Taliban. Forward operating bases were being consolidated, equipment was being transferred or destroyed, and personnel were being redeployed to larger, more secure installations. But buried within the routine reporting about withdrawal logistics, Shirley found references to something else. Several news articles mentioned increased Taliban activity during the same period, including attacks on supply convoys and attempts to capture military equipment that was being moved as part of the withdrawal operations. One article from the Stars and Stripes, dated March 20, 2021, contained a paragraph that made Shirley's hands shake as she read it. Military officials confirmed that Taliban forces had attempted to disrupt coalition supply operations during the past 6 weeks, but noted that critical medical and communications equipment had been successfully evacuated from forward positions despite these threats. Sources suggested that the successful completion of these logistics operations had been essential to ensuring the safety of personnel during the final phase of base consolidations. The timeline matched perfectly with her own deployment. The critical medical and communications equipment mentioned in the article could easily have included the supplies she had insisted on delivering, despite orders to return to base. The successful completion of logistics operations might have been a reference to the network of support personnel whose files she was now digitizing. But the article also mentions something that sent a chill down her spine. Intelligence officials noted that Taliban forces had specifically targeted coalition logistics operations during this period, suggesting coordinated planning aimed at disrupting withdrawal operations and capturing valuable military equipment. If the Taliban had been specifically targeting supply convoys during the period when Shirley had been making her deliveries, it meant that her decision to complete her mission despite orders to turn back had been even more dangerous than she had realized. It also meant that the roadside bomb that had injured her hadn't been a random attack. It had been part of a coordinated enemy campaign designed to disrupt exactly the kind of operation she had been conducting. The next morning, Shirley arrived at work early and immediately began searching through the files for any references to Taliban activity or intelligence reports from the same time period. What she found was fragmentary but troubling. Several of the service records included references to enemy contact during logistics operations or hostile activity in the operational area. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the logistics coordinator whose Bronze Star citation Shirley had found particularly compelling, had been involved in an incident described as coordinated enemy action against coalition supply operations. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, the medic who had saved 12 lives in a single engagement, had been treating casualties from what his medical report described as systematic attacks on forward logistics positions. The pattern was becoming clear, but it was also becoming more disturbing. The logistics network that all of these soldiers had been part of hadn't just been routine withdrawal support. It had been a targeted operation conducted under direct enemy pressure, with Taliban forces specifically attempting to disrupt the movement of critical supplies and equipment. And yet, none of the soldiers involved, including Shirley herself, had been briefed on the true nature of the threat they were facing. They had been told they were conducting routine logistics operations, when in reality they had been operating in the middle of a coordinated enemy campaign designed to disrupt their missions. The question that haunted Shirley was whether this lack of briefing had been an oversight or a deliberate decision. Had their commanders simply failed to share critical intelligence, or had they intentionally kept support personnel uninformed about the true nature of their missions? The answer came from an unexpected source. While processing a file belonging to communications specialist Amanda Price, Shirley discovered a document she had never seen before, an intelligence summary dated February 28, 2021, that had been included in Price's service record by mistake. The document was classified as secret/no foreign and contained a detailed assessment of Taliban capabilities and intentions during the withdrawal period. What it revealed was that coalition intelligence had been fully aware of the coordinated enemy campaign against logistics operations. They had known that supply convoys were being specifically targeted. They had known that Taliban forces were attempting to capture or destroy critical equipment during transportation. Most importantly, they had known that the successful completion of logistics operations during this period would be essential to preventing Taliban forces from obtaining advanced military equipment that could be used against coalition forces or sold to other terrorist organizations. The intelligence summary made it clear that the logistics operations Shirley and her colleagues had been conducting weren't routine support missions. They were high-stakes operations conducted under direct enemy pressure, with strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. But the document also revealed something else that made Shirley feel sick to her stomach. Coalition commanders had made a deliberate decision not to brief support personnel on the true nature of the threat they were facing. The reasoning was outlined in clinical, bureaucratic language. Operational security considerations require that logistics personnel maintain standard operating procedures without awareness of heightened threat levels in order to prevent behavioral changes that might compromise mission effectiveness. In other words, they had been kept in the dark deliberately. Their commanders had known they were operating in a high-threat environment, but had decided that telling them the truth might make them too cautious to complete their missions effectively. Shirley sat in her basement office, staring at the classified document and trying to process what it meant. She and dozens of other soldiers had been sent into danger without being told how dangerous it really was. They had made split-second decisions to complete their missions without understanding that those decisions might have strategic consequences extending far beyond their immediate responsibilities. The bronze medal hanging around her neck suddenly felt different. Not heavier exactly, but more complex. It represented not just her own actions on that day in February, but her unwitting participation in a larger operation that had been designed to succeed despite the risks to the people conducting it. As she carefully returned the classified document to Amanda Price's file, Shirley realized that her investigation had revealed more than she had bargained for. The patterns she had been tracking weren't just interesting coincidences. They were evidence of a systematic operation that involved dozens of soldiers in high-risk missions without their knowledge or consent. And if Army intelligence was now reviewing these files, it suggested that someone was finally ready to acknowledge what had really happened during those 3 months in early 2021, and perhaps to recognize the true significance of the actions taken by soldiers who had thought they were simply doing their jobs. But it also raised a new and more troubling question. If the truth about these operations was finally being revealed, why was Shirley learning about it by accident while processing files in a basement office? And what did it mean that she was apparently the only person who had been given access to all of these records at the same time? The pendant beneath her sweater seemed to pulse with new significance as she considered the possibility that her assignment to digitize these particular files hadn't been as random as it had appeared. The confrontation Shirley had been dreading came on a Tuesday morning when she arrived at her basement office to find Major Vasquez waiting for her, holding a manila folder and wearing an expression that suggested serious trouble. "Specialist Thompson," Major Vasquez said without preamble, "we need to discuss some irregularities in your work performance." Shirley's heart raced as she considered the possibilities. Has someone discovered her notebook? Had they noticed that she was spending too much time reading files instead of simply scanning them? Had Jennifer Walsh reported their conversation about the intelligence authorization documents? "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean," Shirley replied, settling into her chair and trying to project calm professionalism despite the panic building in her chest. Major Vasquez opened the folder and pulled out a series of documents that Shirley recognized immediately. Work logs showing the number of files she had processed each day, digital database records indicating which documents had been scanned and cataloged, and productivity reports comparing her output to standard expectations for data entry personnel. According to these reports, Major Vasquez continued, "You've been spending an average of 47 minutes per file during the past 3 weeks. The standard expectation for this type of work is 12 to 15 minutes per file. Either you're experiencing technical difficulties with the equipment or you're not focusing appropriately on your assigned tasks." The accusation was fair but incomplete. Shirley had indeed been spending much more time with each file than was necessary for simple digitization, but she had also been completing her daily quotas despite the extra time spent analyzing the documents. Her work quality had been excellent, with 0 errors in data entry and perfect accuracy in document classification. "Ma'am, I've been meeting all productivity targets," Shirley said carefully. "Every file assigned to me has been completed according to specifications." "That's not the issue, Specialist. The issue is efficiency and appropriate use of duty time. When you're assigned to scan and catalog documents, that's what you're expected to do, not conduct detailed analysis of the contents." The phrase "detailed analysis" hit Shirley like a physical blow. Someone had been monitoring her work closely enough to know that she was doing more than simple data entry. But how much did they know about what she had discovered? Major Vasquez pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the Fort Braxton Security Office. We've also received a report that you've been accessing public computers at the downtown library to research military operations in Afghanistan. While this isn't strictly prohibited, it's unusual behavior for someone assigned to routine administrative duties. The surveillance had been more comprehensive than Shirley had imagined. Not only were they monitoring her work performance, but they were tracking her off-duty activities as well. The realization that her investigation had been observed from the beginning was both terrifying and illuminating. "Ma'am, I was conducting personal research related to my own deployment experience, which was technically accurate even if it didn't capture the full scope of what she had been doing." "I see." Major Vasquez made a note in her folder. "And does this personal research have anything to do with your apparent fascination with the service records you've been processing?" The question was a trap, and Shirley knew it. Admitting that she had been analyzing the files would confirm that she had discovered patterns that were supposed to remain hidden. Denying it would be an obvious lie to someone who clearly already knew the truth. Before Shirley could formulate a response, Major Vasquez continued speaking, but her tone had shifted from accusatory to something more complex. "Specialist Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you, because I think you've earned the right to understand what's really happening here. Your assignment to this digitization project wasn't random, and it wasn't punishment for being injured. You were specifically selected for this task because someone believed you had the analytical skills and personal investment necessary to identify the patterns you've been discovering." The admission was so unexpected that Shirley felt dizzy. Everything she had assumed about her assignment had been wrong. The basement office, the isolation, the apparent bureaucratic exile, all of it had been designed to create the conditions for her to conduct exactly the kind of investigation she had been pursuing. "I don't understand, ma'am," Shirley said, though she was beginning to suspect that she understood more than she wanted to. Major Vasquez stood up and walked to the small window near Shirley's desk, looking out at the parking lot where a black sedan with government plates had been parked for the past 3 weeks. Shirley had noticed the car but had assumed it belonged to some visiting official or contractor. 3 months ago, Major Vasquez said, still looking out the window, Army intelligence completed a preliminary review of coalition logistics operations during the final phase of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Their analysis suggested that the success of those operations had prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach that could have compromised ongoing counterterrorism efforts across the Middle East. She turned back to face Shirley directly. The problem was that their analysis was based on incomplete information. The after-action reports from field commanders focused on tactical outcomes without capturing the individual decisions made by support personnel that had actually determined the success or failure of critical missions. Shirley felt a chill of recognition. The commanders who had written those after-action reports were the same people who had decided to keep support personnel uninformed about the true nature of their missions. They wouldn't have understood the significance of individual decisions made by soldiers they hadn't trusted with complete information. So they needed someone who had been there, Shirley said slowly. Someone who could analyze the service records and identify connections that weren't apparent in the official reports. Exactly. But they couldn't simply interview the personnel involved because most of them didn't know they had been part of anything significant. They thought they had been conducting routine logistics operations, just like you did until 3 weeks ago. Major Vasquez sat back down and pulled out yet another document, this one bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. What you've discovered through your analysis of these files has confirmed Army intelligence's preliminary assessment and provided details that weren't available through any other source. Your identification of the coordinated logistics network, your timeline analysis, and your recognition of the strategic significance of individual actions, all of that information has been essential to understanding what really happened during those 3 months. The scope of the deception was staggering. Shirley hadn't been conducting an unauthorized investigation of classified information. She had been unknowingly participating in an authorized intelligence review, manipulated into discovering connections that the investigators couldn't have identified through conventional analysis. The classified document you found in Communication Specialist Price's file, Major Vasquez continued, wasn't included by mistake. It was placed there deliberately, as a test to see if you would recognize its significance and understand its implications for the other service records you were processing. Shirley thought about the hours she had spent analyzing that intelligence summary, the sick feeling she had experienced when she realized that support personnel had been deliberately kept uninformed about the dangers they faced. That emotional response hadn't been an accident. It had been the intended outcome of a carefully orchestrated revelation. "So everything I thought I was discovering?" Shirley said. "Not everything. We knew the broad outlines of what had happened, but we didn't understand the individual human decisions that had made the operation successful. We didn't know about your choice to complete the supply delivery despite orders to return to base. We didn't know about the split-second decisions made by medics, communication specialists, and logistics coordinators that had prevented the operation from failing." Major Vasquez opened her folder to a section Shirley hadn't seen before, containing what appeared to be a formal military assessment document. "What your analysis has revealed is that the success of the withdrawal logistics operation wasn't the result of superior planning or tactical execution by field commanders. It was the result of individual initiative taken by support personnel who made the right choices without knowing why those choices mattered." The assessment document contained a list of names that Shirley recognized from the files she had been processing, along with detailed descriptions of actions that had seemed routine at the time but had apparently had strategic significance. Her own name was at the top of the list, with a description of her convoy operation that was far more detailed than anything that had appeared in her official service record. Specialist Thompson's decision to complete supply delivery to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, despite direct orders to return to base, resulted in the successful evacuation of critical communications equipment that would otherwise have been captured by Taliban forces. Subsequent intelligence analysis revealed that this equipment contained encryption protocols that, if compromised, would have endangered ongoing special operations across the theater. Additionally, the medical supplies delivered by Specialist Thompson's convoy enabled FOB Phoenix to serve as a casualty collection point during the evacuation of 3 other forward positions, directly contributing to the successful withdrawal of 127 coalition personnel. Shirley stared at the document, trying to process what it meant. Her simple decision to complete a supply delivery had apparently prevented an intelligence catastrophe and enabled the safe evacuation of over 100 people. But she had never been told about the encryption protocols. She had never been briefed on the planned use of FOB Phoenix as a casualty collection point. She had made her decision based on nothing more than instinct and a commitment to completing her mission. "The question now," Major Vasquez said, "is what we do with this information. Army intelligence has recommended that everyone involved in these operations receive upgraded recognition for their service, but there are complications." She pulled out another document, this one from the Department of Defense Office of Awards and Decorations. "The actions documented in these service records meet the criteria for significantly higher levels of recognition than what was originally awarded. In some cases, including yours, the actions meet the criteria for the highest levels of military decoration." The implication was clear, but Shirley found herself unable to process it emotionally. For months, she had carried the weight of believing that her Bronze Commandant medal was undeserved, a routine award for routine service. Now she was being told that her actions had been extraordinary enough to warrant consideration for awards that she had never imagined receiving. "There's something else you need to know," Major Vasquez continued. "The intelligence review that led to your assignment here was initiated because of concerns about potential congressional investigation into the withdrawal operations." She handed Shirley a newspaper clipping from the Washington Post dated 6 weeks earlier. The headline read, "Questions raised about military equipment security during Afghanistan withdrawal." The article discussed congressional concerns about reports that Taliban forces had captured significant amounts of coalition military equipment during the withdrawal period. "What the congressional investigators don't know," Major Vasquez said, "is that the equipment losses would have been catastrophically worse if support personnel like you hadn't made the decisions they made. The success of individual logistics operations prevented equipment captures that could have compromised ongoing operations across multiple theaters." The political dimension added another layer of complexity to everything Shirley was learning. Her actions and those of her colleagues hadn't just had tactical and strategic military significance. They had apparently prevented a potential political crisis that could have undermined public support for military operations worldwide. As Major Vasquez gathered her documents and prepared to leave, she handed Shirley one final piece of paper. It was a memorandum from the Secretary of the Army, dated just 3 days earlier. "Specialist Thompson," she said, "tomorrow morning you have an appointment with Colonel Foster from Army Intelligence. He's going to brief you on the full scope of what your investigation has revealed and discuss options for how to proceed with formal recognition of your service and the service of your colleagues." After Major Vasquez left, Shirley sat alone in her basement office, surrounded by the files that had seemed like mundane historical records just hours earlier, but now represented evidence of extraordinary actions taken by ordinary soldiers who had never understood the true significance of their choices. The small pendant hanging around her neck felt different now, not heavier or lighter, but somehow more complete, as if it had been waiting for her to understand what it really represented. Colonel Richard Foster's office was nothing like what Shirley had expected. Instead of the sterile military efficiency she associated with intelligence officers, the room felt more like a professor's study. Books lined 2 walls from floor to ceiling, and comfortable chairs were arranged around a coffee table that held maps, photographs, and what appeared to be personal memorabilia from various deployments. Foster himself was equally unexpected. A tall, lean man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested extensive field experience, he greeted Shirley with genuine warmth and immediately noticed her crutches. "Specialist Thompson, thank you for coming. Please sit wherever you're most comfortable. Can I get you coffee? Water?" The informality was disarming. Shirley had prepared herself for a formal briefing, complete with classified presentations and official protocols. Instead, Foster gestured toward the comfortable chairs and waited while she settled herself before taking a seat across from her. "I imagine you have questions," he said with a slight smile. "Major Vasquez told me about your conversation yesterday. I'm sure learning about the true nature of your assignment was unexpected." "Sir, I'm still trying to understand why all of this was necessary," Shirley replied. "If you needed analysis of these operations, why not just conduct official interviews with the personnel involved?" Foster leaned back in his chair and picked up a thick folder from the coffee table. "That's exactly what we tried first. 6 months ago, we conducted formal interviews with 15 logistics personnel who had been involved in withdrawal operations. Would you like to know what we learned?" He opened the folder and pulled out a series of interview transcripts. "Every single person we spoke with described their service in exactly the same terms you used when you first arrived here. Routine operations, standard procedures, nothing unusual or noteworthy. They all believed they had simply done their jobs according to training and regulations." Foster handed her one of the transcripts, and Shirley recognized the interviewee's name immediately. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the logistics coordinator whose Bronze Star citation had first caught her attention weeks earlier. "Listen to this," Foster said, reading from Santos's interview. Question: "Can you describe the events that led to your Bronze Star award?" Answer: "It was just a routine convoy that came under fire. I did what anyone would have done in that situation. Nothing special about it." He looked up at Shirley. "But you've read her full service record. You know that her routine convoy prevented the capture of communications equipment that would have compromised ongoing special operations. You know that her actions under fire enabled the evacuation of a forward operating base that was under coordinated attack." Shirley nodded, remembering the detailed citation that had described actions far more significant than Santos apparently understood. "The problem," Foster continued, "is that none of these soldiers had been briefed on the strategic context of their missions. They made extraordinary decisions based on training, instinct, and personal judgment, but they never learned about the broader implications of those decisions. When we asked them to describe their service, they could only tell us what they had been told at the time, which was deliberately incomplete." He pulled out a map of Afghanistan marked with colored pins representing different types of operations. What we needed was someone who could look at all of these individual stories simultaneously and identify patterns that the participants themselves couldn't see. Someone who had the military experience to understand tactical decisions, but also the analytical skills to recognize strategic connections. Foster pointed to a cluster of pins in the eastern provinces. You were selected because your own service record suggested you had made the same kinds of intuitive decisions under pressure that we were seeing in other cases. We believed that if anyone could understand what had really happened during those 3 months, it would be someone who had lived through similar experiences. The manipulation was sophisticated, but Shirley found herself more fascinated than angry. The intelligence community had created an analytical process that relied on authentic, emotional, and intellectual responses rather than formal briefings or structured interviews. But there was something else, Foster continued, his tone becoming more serious. We needed someone we could trust with information that goes far beyond what appeared in the service records you've been processing. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a security badge that bore Shirley's photograph, along with clearance levels she had never been authorized for. Specialist Thompson, effective immediately, you're being granted temporary access to classified materials related to Operation Cornerstone, the intelligence designation for the withdrawal logistics operations you've been analyzing. The badge felt heavy in her hands, its weight somehow representing the responsibility of knowledge she wasn't sure she wanted. But Foster was already opening another folder, this one marked with classification stamps that indicated information far more sensitive than anything she had seen before. What I'm about to show you will explain why congressional investigators have been asking questions about equipment losses during the withdrawal, he said, and why the actions of support personnel like yourself became absolutely critical to preventing a catastrophic intelligence failure. The first document was a Taliban intelligence assessment, captured during a raid on a safe house in Kabul 3 months after the withdrawal. The document, translated from Pashto, described a coordinated campaign to capture specific types of coalition military equipment during the final phase of operations. The Taliban weren't randomly attacking convoys, Foster explained, as Shirley read through the document. They had detailed intelligence about which types of equipment were being moved, when movements were scheduled, and which routes were being used. This was a systematic effort to capture technology that could be reverse-engineered or sold to hostile foreign governments. The specificity was chilling. The document listed exact models of communications equipment, encryption devices, and advanced weapon systems that they were prioritizing for capture. It included detailed descriptions of coalition convoy procedures and security protocols that suggested extensive intelligence penetration. The equipment you delivered to FOB Phoenix, Foster continued, pulling out another document, included 3 encrypted communication units that contained software used by special operations forces across multiple theaters. If those units had been captured, the Taliban would have gained access to communication protocols used by coalition forces in Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and the Philippines. He showed her technical specifications for the equipment that had been in her convoy, along with intelligence assessments of what Taliban forces could have accomplished with access to that technology. The potential damage extended far beyond Afghanistan, potentially compromising ongoing operations across the entire Middle East and Africa. But that's not the worst part, Foster said grimly. We've since learned that the Taliban had arrangements to transfer captured coalition technology to foreign intelligence services. China, Russia, Iran, they were all interested in acquiring advanced American military communications equipment. He pulled out intercepts of communications between Taliban leadership and foreign contacts, showing negotiations for the sale of captured coalition equipment. The prices being discussed were in the millions of dollars, suggesting that successful capture operations would have provided significant funding for ongoing Taliban activities. Your decision to complete that supply delivery didn't just save the lives of soldiers at FOB Phoenix, Foster said. It prevented advanced American military technology from falling into the hands of foreign governments that would have used it to compromise ongoing operations and endanger American personnel worldwide. The scope of what she was learning was overwhelming. Shirley had always known that her convoy had carried important supplies, but she had never imagined that those supplies included equipment whose capture could have had global strategic implications. Foster opened yet another section of the folder, revealing what appeared to be a comprehensive assessment of the entire withdrawal logistics operation. What your analysis of the service records confirmed is that the success of Operation Cornerstone wasn't the result of superior planning by senior commanders. It was the result of dozens of individual decisions made by support personnel who chose to complete their missions despite orders, obstacles, and enemy action. The assessment contained a detailed breakdown of critical moments during the withdrawal when the success or failure of the entire operation had depended on choices made by soldiers who had no idea how much was at stake, communication specialists who had maintained contact despite equipment failures, medics who had treated casualties under fire without knowing that their patients were carrying critical intelligence, supply sergeants who had delivered equipment despite route changes and security threats. In every case, Foster explained, success requires someone to go beyond their orders, to make decisions based on judgment rather than procedure. The Taliban campaign was designed to exploit standard military protocols, but it failed because soldiers like you made non-standard decisions. He showed her a timeline that mapped individual actions against Taliban intelligence reports, demonstrating how each successful logistics operation had disrupted enemy plans and prevented equipment captures that would have had cascading effects across multiple operational theaters. "This brings us to why you're here today," Foster said, closing the classified folder and pulling out a different set of documents. "Based on your analysis of the service records and the intelligence we've developed about Operation Cornerstone, the Department of Defense has concluded that multiple personnel deserve recognition significantly beyond what they originally received." The documents were formal recommendations for upgraded military decorations, including several nominations for the Silver Star and Bronze Star with Valor. But the recommendation at the top of the stack made Shirley's breath catch in her throat. "Specialist Shirley Thompson," Foster read from the formal citation, "is hereby recommended for award of the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty during combat operations against an armed enemy in Afghanistan." The words seemed to hang in the air. The Medal of Honor wasn't just the highest military decoration. It represented a level of heroism that Shirley had never imagined applying to her own actions. She thought about the simple decision to complete a supply delivery, the split-second choice that had seemed obvious at the time but had apparently prevented an intelligence catastrophe. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand," she said quietly. "What I did was it was just what needed to be done." Foster smiled. The same expression she had seen on Major Vasquez's face when she had been trying to explain the significance of patterns that Shirley had been discovering. "Specialist Thompson, that's exactly what every Medal of Honor recipient says. The willingness to do what needs to be done, regardless of personal risk or official orders, is precisely what the medal recognizes." He handed her the complete nomination package, including supporting documentation from intelligence analysts, testimony from coalition personnel who had benefited from her actions, and assessments from foreign policy experts about the strategic implications of preventing equipment captures. "The ceremony is scheduled for 6 weeks from today," Foster said. "The President has personally reviewed your case and agreed to present the award. But before we proceed, there's something else you need to know." He pulled out one final document, this one bearing the letterhead of the House Armed Services Committee. "The congressional investigation that prompted our review of these operations has concluded. The committee's final report credits the success of withdrawal logistics operations with preventing what they describe as potentially catastrophic losses of advanced military technology to hostile foreign governments." Foster looked directly at Shirley. What the report doesn't mention is that this success was achieved primarily through the individual initiative of support personnel who made extraordinary decisions without official authorization or recognition. The committee has recommended that all personnel involved in these operations receive appropriate recognition for their service. As Shirley left Colonel Foster's office, carrying authorization documents that would change her security clearance and her understanding of her own service, she realized that the small bronze medal hanging around her neck had been just the beginning of a story she was only now learning to tell. The crutches that had made her the object of dismissive laughter at Fort Braxton suddenly felt different as she made her way across the base. They weren't symbols of weakness or limitations, they were evidence of service in operations that had shaped the strategic balance of an entire region, carried by someone whose actions had prevented consequences she was only now beginning to understand. The transformation in how people treated Shirley at Fort Braxton was immediate and profound, but not in the way she had expected. Word of her upgraded security clearance had spread through the base's administrative channels within hours of her meeting with Colonel Foster, and suddenly everyone seemed to know that the quiet woman on crutches was involved in something far more significant than routine file processing. Captain Morrison, who had initially suggested she might be suitable for filing duties, now nodded respectfully when they passed in the corridors. Major Vasquez began including her in morning briefings that she had never been invited to before. Even the maintenance staff who worked in Building 7 treated her with a deference that suggested they understood she was connected to operations beyond their security clearance level. But the most dramatic change came from an unexpected source. Sergeant First Class Kevin Martinez, a decorated infantry veteran who had been assigned to Fort Braxton after completing 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Martinez was exactly the kind of soldier that Shirley had always felt intimidated by, confident, physically imposing, with the kind of combat experience that earned automatic respect from both enlisted and officers. She encountered him in the main cafeteria during lunch, struggling to balance her meal tray while managing her crutches. Before she could decline help, Martinez had taken her tray and was guiding her toward an empty table near the windows. "Specialist Thompson," he said as they sat down, "I hope you don't mind the company. I've been wanting to talk to you since I heard about your new assignment." Shirley was confused. As far as she knew, her work with Colonel Foster was classified, and certainly wasn't something that should be common knowledge among the enlisted ranks at Fort Braxton. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sergeant," she replied carefully. Martinez leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, I was part of the security detail for FOB Phoenix during the withdrawal operations. I was there when your convoy arrived with those medical supplies and communications equipment." The revelation hit Shirley like a physical blow. For months, she had thought about the soldiers she had delivered supplies to in abstract terms, faceless recipients of materials that had apparently been more critical than she had understood at the time. But here was someone who had been there, someone who had witnessed the delivery that had changed the trajectory of her military service and potentially prevented an intelligence catastrophe. "I remember that day clearly," Martinez continued. "We had been expecting your convoy hours earlier, and when you didn't arrive on schedule, our command assumed the mission had been scrubbed. We started preparing to evacuate the base without the equipment and supplies you were carrying." He paused to take a drink of coffee, and Shirley could see something in his expression that suggested he was remembering details that weren't entirely pleasant. "What I didn't know at the time," he said, "was how critical those supplies were going to be. About 6 hours after your convoy arrived, we started receiving casualties from 3 different firefights in our sector. Without the medical supplies you delivered, we would have lost at least half of those wounded soldiers." Shirley felt her throat tighten. She had never received feedback about how the supplies she delivered had been used, never learned whether her decision to complete the mission had actually made a difference in anyone's life. "But it wasn't just the medical supplies," Martinez continued. "The communications equipment you brought allowed us to coordinate casualty evacuation from the other forward operating bases that were being shut down. We became the primary collection point for wounded personnel from across the entire sector." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph that made her breath catch. It was a group shot of soldiers standing in front of FOB Phoenix, some bandaged, others on crutches, all wearing the expressions of people who had survived something they hadn't expected to live through. "These are some of the soldiers who were treated at Phoenix using the medical supplies from your convoy," Martinez said. 19 guys who went home to their families instead of coming home in flag-draped coffins."
The faces in the photograph were young, mostly, with the kind of serious expressions that suggested they understood how close they had come to not making it home at all. Shirley found herself studying each face, trying to imagine the lives that had continued because of a decision she had made in a moment of frustration and determination. "There's something else," Martinez said, putting his phone away. "I don't know if anyone's told you this, but the Taliban hit 2 other supply convoys that same day, convoys that were carrying similar equipment to other forward operating bases." Shirley shook her head. Colonel Foster had mentioned that Taliban forces had been systematically targeting logistics operations, but he hadn't provided specific details about other attacks. "Both of those convoys turned back when they received orders to abort their missions," Martinez explained. "Standard protocol, exactly what your convoy was supposed to do. But because they followed orders, the bases they were supposed to resupply had to be evacuated without critical equipment." He leaned back in his chair, and Shirley could see that he was choosing his words carefully. One of those bases had to destroy over $2 million worth of communications equipment, rather than let it fall into Taliban hands. Another base lost encrypted computer systems that contained intelligence about ongoing special operations. The Taliban captured some of that equipment during the evacuation. The implications were staggering. While Shirley's decision to ignore orders and complete her mission had prevented equipment captures that could have compromised operations across multiple theaters, other supply teams had followed standard procedures and inadvertently enabled exactly the kind of intelligence losses that Operation Cornerstone had been designed to prevent. "Sergeant Martinez," Shirley said quietly, "how do you know all of this?" Martinez smiled grimly. "Because 3 weeks ago, I was called in for a classified debriefing about the operations at FOB Phoenix. They wanted to know everything I could remember about the convoy deliveries, the casualty evacuations, and the equipment that was processed through our base during the final week of operations."
He pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages of handwritten notes. They were particularly interested in the timing of your convoy's arrival and whether the late delivery had affected our operational capabilities. What I told them was that your convoy arriving late actually worked in our favor because it meant we had the medical supplies and communications equipment in place exactly when we needed them most. Shirley realized that Martinez had been interviewed as part of the same intelligence review that had led to her assignment to analyze service records. His testimony had likely been part of the evidence used to support the Medal of Honor recommendation that Colonel Foster had presented to her. "There's something else I think you should know," Martinez said, his tone becoming more serious. "The debriefing team asked me specifically about your behavior during the convoy delivery. They wanted to know if you had seemed nervous, confused, or uncertain about your mission. What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth, that you and your team were focused, professional, and clearly committed to completing your delivery despite whatever obstacles you had encountered along the way. I told them that your convoy leader, I think it was Staff Sergeant Kim, seemed relieved to finally reach the base, but that you were already focused on preparing for the return trip." Martinez flipped to another page in his notebook. "They also asked me about the condition of the equipment you delivered, whether it appeared to have been damaged or compromised during transport." This was a detail that Shirley hadn't considered. The roadside bomb that had injured her and ended her deployment had occurred during the return trip from FOB Phoenix, but apparently intelligence analysts had been concerned about whether the equipment she had delivered had been somehow compromised before it reached its destination. "I told them that everything you delivered was in perfect condition," Martinez continued. "The communications equipment was properly packaged and sealed, the medical supplies were organized and inventoried exactly according to specifications. Whatever route you had taken to reach us, you had protected that equipment like your life depended on it." The phrase echoed in Shirley's mind. Like your life depended on it. In retrospect, the security of that equipment had been far more important than her individual safety, but she had made her decisions based on military training and personal commitment rather than strategic analysis. "Sergeant Martinez," she said, "did they tell you why they were conducting these debriefings?" Martinez closed his notebook and looked directly at her. "Ma'am, they didn't give me specifics, but it's pretty clear that something significant is about to happen.
I've been through enough military ceremonies to recognize when the Army is preparing to acknowledge actions that were previously classified or underappreciated. He paused, and Shirley could see that he was deciding whether to share additional information. I've heard rumors that several personnel from the withdrawal operations are being considered for upgraded recognition. Word is that some of the actions taken by support personnel during those final months prevented intelligence losses that could have compromised ongoing operations worldwide. The confirmation that rumors about upgraded decorations were circulating among the enlisted ranks suggested that the Medal of Honor ceremony was going to be far more public than she had anticipated. She had been thinking about it as a personal recognition, but it was apparently being treated as a significant military and political event. "There's one more thing," Martinez said, pulling out an official-looking envelope that bore the Fort Braxton letterhead. "I was asked to give this to you when I have the opportunity." Inside the envelope was a formal invitation to speak at a ceremony honoring all personnel who had been involved in Operation Cornerstone. The event was scheduled for the week before her Medal of Honor presentation, and the guest list included members of Congress, senior military officials, and representatives from allied governments whose operations had been protected by the prevention of equipment captures. "They want me to speak?" Shirley asked, reading through the invitation with a growing alarm. "Ma'am, I think they want you to tell your story. Not the classified details, but the human story of what it was like to make those decisions without understanding their full significance." Martinez stood up, preparing to leave. "For what it's worth, Specialist Thompson, I'm glad you made the choice you did. 19 families have their sons and fathers home because you decided to complete your mission. That's worth celebrating, regardless of what else your actions accomplished." As Martinez walked away, Shirley sat alone in the cafeteria, holding the invitation and thinking about the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. Speaking publicly about her service would mean acknowledging that her actions had been extraordinary rather than routine, accepting recognition that she still wasn't entirely sure she deserved. But it would also mean giving voice to the experiences of dozens of other support personnel whose stories had been overshadowed by the classified nature of their strategic significance. Soldiers like Maria Santos, Robert Hayes, and Amanda Price, whose individual decisions had prevented intelligence failures and saved lives in ways they had never been told about. The pendant hanging around her neck felt heavier as she considered the possibility that her Medal of Honor ceremony wouldn't just be about her own recognition, but about acknowledging the broader truth that extraordinary heroism often came from ordinary soldiers making split-second decisions based on training, instinct, and commitment rather than complete information about strategic objectives. As she made her way back to Building 7, moving carefully on her crutches across the busy courtyard, Shirley realized that the real challenge wouldn't be accepting the recognition she was about to receive. It would be finding a way to honor the sacrifices and decisions of all the soldiers whose stories had become part of her own, and whose actions had shaped the outcome of operations they had never been fully briefed on. The laughter that had greeted her arrival at Fort Braxton seemed like a memory from another lifetime, replaced by the weight of understanding what her service had really meant and the responsibility of representing everyone whose heroism had been hidden in classified files and bureaucratic understatement. The East Room of the White House was filled with a tension that Shirley had never experienced before. Unlike typical military ceremonies, this event carried the weight of revelations that would reshape public understanding of what had happened during the final months of America's longest war. Seated in the front row were the families of soldiers whose lives had been saved by operations they were only now learning about. Behind them sat members of Congress who had spent months investigating equipment losses without knowing how much worse those losses could have been. But what struck Shirley most as she waited in the Blue Room was the presence of people she had never expected to see. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos sat with her husband and 2 young children, wearing dress blues decorated with the silver star she had received just weeks earlier when her Bronze Star had been upgraded based on newly declassified intelligence about her convoy operations.
Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes was there with his wife, his Purple Heart now accompanied by a Distinguished Service Cross that recognized his actions in saving 12 lives during coordinated Taliban attacks on medical evacuation routes. "Nervous?" asked communications specialist Amanda Price, who had been standing beside Shirley in the holding room. Price had received the Soldier's Medal for her role in maintaining communications networks that had enabled the coordination of withdrawal operations across 3 provinces, though she was still learning about the strategic significance of keeping those networks operational during critical periods. "Terrified," Shirley admitted. The weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. In a few minutes, she would become only the 3rd woman in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, joining a brotherhood that included names like Audie Murphy, Alvin York, and every generation of American military heroes since the Civil War. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. The Marine Band struck up "Hail to the Chief" as President Sarah Chen entered the East Room. Chen was herself a veteran, having served as a Navy intelligence officer before entering politics, and she had personally reviewed every aspect of Shirley's case before approving the Medal of Honor recommendation. As the assembly rose to their feet, Shirley caught sight of Captain Morrison and Major Vasquez standing near the back of the room. The same officers who had dismissed her as suitable only for filing duties now stood at attention as she prepared to receive the nation's highest military honor. Their presence wasn't hostile or embarrassed. If anything, they looked proud to be associated with someone whose service they were finally beginning to understand. "Today," President Chen began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "we gather to correct a historical oversight and to acknowledge truths that have remained classified until now. The operations we honor today represent a different kind of heroism, the heroism of individuals who made extraordinary decisions without understanding their full significance, who chose to act on principle rather than protocol, and who prevented consequences that could have endangered American military personnel worldwide." The president gestured toward a display that had been set up near the podium, showing maps, photographs, and documents that illustrated the scope of Operation Cornerstone and its impact on global security operations. For nearly 2 years, the actions of the men and women we honor today remained hidden in classified files, their significance only understood by intelligence analysts and senior military commanders. But recently declassified information has revealed that their individual decisions made under extreme pressure, and often in direct contradiction to official orders, prevented intelligence losses that could have compromised ongoing operations in Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and the Philippines. President Chen opened a letter folder containing the Medal of Honor citation that would be read publicly for the first time. Specialist Shirley Thompson distinguished herself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as a logistics coordinator with the 82nd Airborne Division during combat operations against an armed enemy in Afghanistan on February 23, 2021. The formal language couldn't capture the reality of that day, the weight of the decision to ignore direct orders, the fear that she was making a catastrophic mistake, the determination to complete a mission that had seemed simple but had turned out to be anything but routine. When Specialist Thompson's convoy received orders to return to base rather than complete their supply delivery to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she made the decision to countermand those orders and continue to their destination. This decision was made despite intelligence reports indicating increased Taliban activity in the operational area and despite explicit instructions from superior officers to prioritize convoy security over mission completion. Shirley thought about Staff Sergeant Kim, her convoy commander, who had been torn between following orders and completing their mission. Kim had ultimately supported her decision, but she had never learned whether he had faced disciplinary action for allowing the convoy to continue against direct orders. Specialist Thompson's convoy successfully delivered critical medical supplies and communications equipment to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, enabling that installation to serve as a casualty collection point for wounded personnel evacuated from 3 other forward operating bases during coordinated Taliban attacks. The medical supplies she delivered directly enabled life-saving treatment for 19 wounded American and coalition soldiers. The president looked up from the citation and made eye contact with Shirley. But the strategic significance of Specialist Thompson's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The communications equipment delivered by her convoy contained encryption protocols used by special operations forces across multiple theaters. Taliban intelligence had specifically targeted this equipment for capture, intending to transfer it to foreign intelligence services. This was information that Shirley only learned during her final briefing with Colonel Foster. The simple communications equipment she had helped deliver hadn't just been valuable, it had been a primary target of coordinated enemy intelligence operations designed to compromise American military capabilities worldwide. Intelligence assessments now indicate that Specialist Thompson's decision to complete her delivery mission prevented the capture of encryption technology that would have endangered ongoing special operations in at least 6 countries, potentially resulting in the deaths of dozens of American military personnel and intelligence operatives. The scope of consequences continued to expand beyond anything Shirley had imagined when she made her decision in that moment of frustration and determination. She had been thinking about the soldiers at FOB Phoenix who needed medical supplies, not about special operations forces in countries she had never deployed to. Furthermore, the successful delivery of communications equipment to Forward Operating Base Phoenix enabled the coordination of withdrawal operations that prevented the loss of over $50 million in advanced military technology that Taliban forces had planned to capture and transfer to hostile foreign governments. President Chen closed the citation folder and picked up the Medal of Honor itself, a 5-pointed star hanging from a light blue ribbon representing the highest form of recognition the United States could bestow upon one of its soldiers. Specialist Thompson's extraordinary heroism, selfless service, and unwavering commitment to her fellow soldiers, demonstrated at grave personal risk and in direct defiance of explicit orders, prevented intelligence losses that would have compromised American military operations worldwide and endangered the lives of countless American service members. As the president placed the medal around Shirley's neck, she felt the weight of it settle against her chest. But more than the physical weight of the golden enamel, she felt the weight of responsibility, not just to honor the recognition she was receiving, but to represent all the soldiers whose stories had become part of her own. Specialist Shirley Thompson, President Chen said, stepping back and saluting. Medal of Honor. The applause that filled the East Room was unlike anything Shirley had ever experienced. But as she looked out at the assembly, she found herself focusing on specific faces that represented the human impact of decisions made in moments of chaos and uncertainty. Sergeant Martinez was there, along with several other soldiers from FOB Phoenix who had traveled to Washington specifically for this ceremony. They were applauding not just for her recognition, but for the acknowledgement of operations that had saved their lives and enabled their safe return home. Maria Santos was holding her youngest child, a daughter who had been born 6 months after Santos returned from Afghanistan. That child existed because her mother had made split-second decisions under enemy fire that had seemed routine at the time but had turned out to be strategically critical. Amanda Price was standing next to her husband, a fellow communications specialist who had served in Iraq during the same period when the encryption protocols delivered by Shirley's convoy was protecting his operations in a different theater. During the reception that followed the ceremony, Shirley found herself in a receiving line that included people whose lives had been touched by Operation Cornerstone in ways both direct and indirect. Foreign diplomats thanked her for actions that had protected their personnel in embassy compounds across the Middle East. Congressional representatives acknowledged her role in preventing intelligence losses that could have compromised ongoing counterterrorism efforts. But the conversation that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Chen from Walter Reed, the psychiatrist who had helped Shirley process her combat experiences, had been invited to the ceremony as recognition of her role in identifying symptoms that had led to the intelligence review of withdrawal operations. "Shirley," Dr. Chen said, "do you remember our early sessions when you kept saying that you felt like there was something unfinished about your service, something you couldn't quite articulate?" Shirley nodded. Those feelings of incompleteness had been one of the most troubling aspects of her adjustment to civilian life, a sense that there had been more to her deployment than she understood.
What you were feeling was the weight of consequences you hadn't been told about, Dr. Chen continued. Your subconscious mind understood that your actions had been more significant than your conscious mind could process. The therapy that helped you wasn't just about processing trauma, it was about preparing you to understand the full scope of what you had accomplished.
The revelation added another layer to everything Shirley had learned about her assignment to Fort Braxton. Even her psychological treatment had been part of a larger process designed to prepare her for the intelligence review that had led to her Medal of Honor recommendation. As the evening wound down, Shirley found herself standing on the White House South Lawn with several of the other decorated veterans, looking back at the illuminated windows of the building where American history had been made for over 2 centuries. "You know what I keep thinking about?" said Robert Hayes, his Distinguished Service Cross catching the light from the building. "All those ordinary moments during our deployments when we made decisions that seemed obvious at the time. Turns out those ordinary moments were actually extraordinary, but we didn't know it." "That's what I'm going to tell people when they ask me about this," Amanda Price added, "that heroism isn't about feeling heroic. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you don't understand why it matters." Shirley looked down at the Medal of Honor hanging around her neck, feeling its weight against the simple bronze commendation medal that had started her journey of discovery. Both medals told the same story, just at different levels of understanding. 6 months later, Shirley received a letter that brought everything full circle. It was from Jennifer Morrison, the wife of Staff Sergeant Kim, her convoy commander who had supported her decision to complete their mission despite direct orders to return to base. The letter contained a photograph of Kim in dress uniform, wearing the silver star he had received when his bronze star was upgraded based on newly declassified intelligence about his role in Operation Cornerstone. But more importantly, it contained news that his actions were being used as a case study at the Army Command and General Staff College, teaching future officers about the importance of supporting subordinates who demonstrate initiative under pressure. "He wanted you to know," Jennifer Morrison wrote, "that supporting your decision to complete the mission was the best command decision he ever made, not because of the recognition he received, but because it meant trusting a soldier who understood what needed to be done even when the bigger picture wasn't clear." Shirley kept that letter on her desk next to the Medal of Honor and the Bronze Commendation Medal that had seemed so insignificant just a year earlier. Together, they represented a truth that had taken her months to understand, that courage isn't the absence of doubt or fear, but the decision to act according to principle when the stakes are unclear and the consequences are unknown. The crutches that had made her the object of dismissive laughter at Fort Braxton now stood in a place of honor in her home, not as symbols of limitation, but as reminders that extraordinary heroism often comes in unexpected forms, carried by ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in moments when doing the right thing matters more than following the rules. And sometimes those choices ripple outward in ways that change the world, touching lives and protecting operations and preventing consequences that the people making those choices never could have imagined, but always hoped their actions might somehow matter in the end. 3 years after the White House ceremony, Shirley received an invitation that would complete her understanding of just how far those ripples had traveled. The invitation came from General Patricia Williams, who had been promoted to lead the Army's new Strategic Decision-Making Institute, a research facility dedicated to studying how individual initiative affects large-scale military outcomes. "We're establishing a new program," General Williams explained during their meeting at the Pentagon, "designed to train military leaders to recognize and support the kind of principled decision-making that characterized Operation Cornerstone. Your story has become the foundation case study for this program." The Strategic Decision-Making Institute had been analyzing military operations from the past 50 years, looking for patterns where individual initiative had produced outcomes far beyond what formal planning could have achieved. Shirley's convoy operation had become the primary example of how supporting subordinates' judgment, even when it contradicted official orders, could prevent strategic failures.
We've identified over 200 similar cases, General Williams continued, showing Shirley a presentation that mapped individual decisions against strategic outcomes across multiple conflicts: Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. In every case, the difference between success and catastrophic failure came down to someone like you making a choice that seemed obvious at the time but turned out to be strategically critical. The program was being implemented at West Point, the Command and General Staff College, and the War College, teaching future military leaders to recognize when rigid adherence to protocol might prevent mission success. Officers were being trained to evaluate subordinates' initiatives not just on immediate tactical outcomes, but on their potential strategic implications. The most important lesson, General Williams explained, is that the people closest to the operational situation often understand things that senior commanders working from incomplete information cannot see. Your decision to complete the supply delivery despite orders wasn't insubordination, it was strategic thinking at the tactical level.
But the program's impact extended beyond military education. Foreign governments had requested access to the Strategic Decision-Making Institute's research, recognizing that the principles demonstrated during Operation Cornerstone could be applied to civilian emergency response, corporate crisis management, and international diplomatic operations. Shirley learned that her story had been shared with emergency response teams dealing with natural disasters, where individual responders often had to make critical decisions without complete information about broader rescue operations. Fire departments, police forces, and medical emergency teams were using Operation Cornerstone as a case study for training personnel to exercise judgment under pressure. 6 months later, Shirley received a letter that revealed yet another dimension of her story's impact. The letter came from Dr. Sarah Kim, Staff Sergeant Kim's daughter, who was completing her medical residency at Johns Hopkins Hospital. "Dear Miss Thompson," the letter began, "my father told me about the decision you made during your convoy operation and how supporting that decision became one of the defining moments of his military career. I wanted you to know that story influenced my own choice to become a doctor." Dr. Kim explained that her father's experience during Operation Cornerstone had taught her that the most important moments in any profession come when you have to choose between following established procedures and doing what you believe is right for the people you're trying to help. "During my emergency medicine rotation," she wrote, "I've encountered several situations where standard protocols would have delayed treatment that patients needed immediately. Each time, I thought about my father's decision to support your initiative, and I found the courage to advocate for my patients even when it meant challenging senior physicians." The letter included examples of medical emergencies where Dr. Kim's willingness to question standard procedures had resulted in better patient outcomes. In one case, she had insisted on performing an emergency procedure that senior doctors considered unnecessary, preventing a patient's condition from deteriorating while they waited for additional test results. "Your example taught me that sometimes the people closest to the situation understand things that people in authority positions cannot see," Dr. Kim concluded. "That lesson has made me a better doctor and, I hope, a better person." But perhaps the most unexpected continuation of her story came through a program that Shirley had never heard of until she received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA had established a new counseling initiative specifically for veterans who had served in support roles during critical operations without understanding their strategic significance. "We're seeing a pattern," explained Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the psychologist who directed the program. "Veterans who served in logistics, communications, medical support, and other non-combat roles during major operations often experience a form of psychological distress that doesn't fit standard PTSD profiles." The symptoms were similar to what Shirley had experienced after her deployment: a sense of incompleteness, nagging doubts about the significance of their service, and difficulty articulating why their military experience felt unfinished despite successful completion of assigned duties. "What we've learned from studying Operation Cornerstone," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "is that many veterans carry the psychological weight of actions whose consequences they were never told about. They made critical decisions without understanding why those decisions mattered, and that disconnect creates a specific type of emotional burden." The program was using Shirley's story as a framework for helping other veterans understand that their service had been more significant than they realized.
Veterans were being connected with intelligence analysts, field commanders, and fellow soldiers who could provide context about the broader implications of operations they had participated in. The goal isn't just to make people feel better about their service, Dr. Rodriguez explained. It's to help them understand that their experience of making important decisions without complete information is actually one of the most valuable skills they developed during their military service. The program had expanded to include workshops for civilian employers, teaching them to recognize and utilize the decision-making capabilities that veterans had developed through experiences like Operation Cornerstone. Companies were learning that veterans who had served in support roles often possessed analytical and judgment skills that were directly applicable to corporate crisis management and strategic planning. 5 years after her Medal of Honor ceremony, Shirley found herself standing before an audience at the National Defense University, delivering a lecture that would be broadcast to military installations worldwide. The lecture was part of a series called Strategic Thinking at the Tactical Level, designed to teach military personnel at all ranks how to recognize when their individual actions might have broader implications. The question isn't whether you'll face moments when you have to choose between following orders and doing what you believe is right, Shirley told the audience. The question is whether you'll have the courage to trust your judgment and accept responsibility for the consequences of your choices. She looked out at an audience that included enlisted personnel, junior officers, and senior commanders, all of whom were grappling with the same fundamental challenge that had defined her convoy operation: how to make good decisions when you don't have complete information about what's at stake. What I learned through Operation Cornerstone, she continued, is that the people who are actually implementing missions often understand things that planners and commanders cannot see. Your job isn't just to follow orders, it's to use your judgment to ensure that the mission succeeds, even when the orders you've been given are based on incomplete or outdated information.
The lecture was followed by a question-and-answer session that revealed how deeply her story had penetrated military thinking. Officers described situations where they had encountered subordinates making decisions similar to Shirley's, and how they had learned to support initiative rather than suppress it. Enlisted personnel shared examples of moments when they had chosen to exercise judgment rather than blindly follow procedures, and how those choices had affected mission outcomes in ways they were only now beginning to understand. But the most profound question came from a young logistics specialist who was preparing for her first deployment to a region where coalition forces were conducting withdrawal operations similar to those Shirley had participated in. "Ma'am," the specialist asked, "how do you prepare mentally for making decisions when you know that the consequences might be bigger than anything you can imagine?" Shirley considered the question carefully, thinking about all the ways her understanding of her own service had evolved over the years since her convoy operation. "You prepare by accepting that doing the right thing is more important than following the rules," she replied. "You prepare by understanding that the people you're serving, your fellow soldiers, the civilians who depend on military operations, the strategic objectives that extend far beyond any individual mission, deserve your best judgment, not just your obedience." She paused, looking directly at the young specialist who had asked the question. "And you prepare by trusting that if you make decisions based on principle rather than protocol, the consequences will be something you can live with regardless of whether you ever learn what those consequences actually were." As Shirley left the National Defense University that day, she reflected on how completely her understanding of her own story had changed. What had begun as a simple decision to complete a supply delivery had evolved into a framework for thinking about leadership, responsibility, and the relationship between individual actions and strategic outcomes. The Medal of Honor hanging in her home represented more than personal recognition. It had become a symbol of the principle that extraordinary heroism often emerges from ordinary people who refuse to accept that following orders is more important than doing what's right. And the crutches that had once made her the object of dismissive laughter now served as a reminder that limitations and challenges don't prevent people from making choices that change the world. They simply change the context in which those choices are made, and sometimes make the courage required to make them even more remarkable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.